Thank you so much for the keynote. We will now proceed with presenting the panel. And if you have the clicker, you just send it around, because we're going to go in order of the program. So the first one out is Camille.
Oh, okay. So, okay.
You should now
move a microphone towards you.
Okay.
Good plan.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to go through a lightning speed because we have very little time. I haven't met everyone on this panel yet, so I'm eager to find out who everyone is. But I'm going to say I'm going to justify why I'm allowed to be on this panel, and it's because I was involved. I'm going to go back. I was involved in some very early art science. I guess festival activities in Vancouver in 2002, I think it says, 2002 to 2004, and then managed to be a researcher on a very interesting wearable technology project early in the mid-2000s, early 2000s with some amazing art scientists, Tekla Schiffhorst and Susan Kozel. And from this experience, I started my own I guess tech performance project society for a few years, and then I came over across the pond and was in the UK, did a PhD connecting mobile phones, wearables, and video online, and strangely it led me to what we're now calling STARTS, but what was part of the first meeting, I guess, in Brussels in 2012, bringing artists and technologists together, which led to a project that I was on. I'll just go back a bit, called FET Art ICT Connect, which Lucas Evers was also part of, and a few other people were aware of. And it led to 19 very short but very lovely residencies over a 3-month period, which sort of set, I think, the ball rolling a little bit. Meanwhile, I was also involved in teaching young people how to make circuits and make little artistic projects. I started a little meetup group that's been going since 2014, which brings artists and designers together with engineers to make e-textiles and wearable technologies and share information and skills. And it's still going. We're moving into bio art and biotech now. I have my own practice, which is bringing wearable technology to dance and performance, and making bespoke garments and working with haptics. I teach artists how to be technologists as well in my university. I put together a book with my longtime collaborator, Kate Sicchio, of a number of artists talking about their creative process, working with technology as a tool or as a sometimes collaborator. And from that, I felt it was important to initiate this project, which was about trying to get artists and designers to work with technologists to deal with a hard problem, which is making wearable technology and e-textiles, and by extension, fashion, textiles industry, and technology, ethical and sustainable. And it ended last year, but we still have a lot of the projects under the STARTS umbrella currently, and being involved in other projects. And we had 46 projects that we funded over 2 years, and they were all different kinds of projects. They did all kinds of permutations of what is ethical and sustainable technology. At the same time, I was writing a book about mobile phones and other kinds of mobile technologies, wearables, VR, in performance. I'm currently working on an immersive project that's focusing on women and women's bodies, and difficult topics around disease. And another project's focusing on climate change and climate denial and dealing with how to create climate resilience and stewardship. And this brings me to the main slides that I brought with me, which is that STARTS is fairly young in the long history of Leonardo and all these other amazing initiatives, EAT and so on. But it's been doing a lot of really interesting and amazing things. And so this is kind of a timeline that we're developing and that we're going to put on the starts.eu website. This is the first half, and this is the second half. And these are projects that are happening now. And I'm working with Start's ecosystem, which is meant to create an umbrella over all these projects and bring the community together and promote the artists, promote the organizations, promote calls, and connect with organizations like Leonardo and all these other long-standing organizations, and try to keep that network developing and growing. So just a plug for Starts EU, and that's why I'm here. Thank you.
So next one out is David Berman. You.
The clicker.
Clicker.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm from Queen Mary and I'm a theoretical physicist. So what am I doing here? Well, for the last, I put up there 10 years, but maybe even 15, we've had a series of collaborations with artists and done a whole variety of things that mostly were about going into the arts community and going beyond the university and engaging with galleries, film festivals, art fairs, and also sending scientists out, mostly me, to London art institutions like Tate Modern, Royal College of Art and so on, and then telling artists all about things like string theory, relativity and quantum mechanics. What we don't do is in-reach, as I call it, which a lot of things can happen at universities when we get grants for various sort of outreach events that involves us talking to ourselves. So we've been very careful that although there is value to it, it's not what we do. We don't want artists to come in and then give us an installation in our foyer. What we want is actually to produce something that goes out into the world and be part of a productive capability there. And crucially, we do not want pedagogy. Often scientists see artists as a way of teaching science better. That's not what we want. We want to change people's minds and how they think, and that's sometimes an emotional experience or a feeling. We are not interested in saying this is how electromagnetism looks like. Draw it, please, because that's sometimes something that goes a bit wrong. Why? We should always ask ourselves why. There's been a lot spoken so far at the conference about societal change, about the challenges that the world faces. And I must apologize, we're not so ambitious. We are much more interested and influenced by history, the sort of thing that happened at the beginning of the 20th century, where people's minds were changed by very abstract developments, such as in modernism, such as in the birth of quantum mechanics, such as in the birth of relativity. Einstein, when he invented relativity, did not intend to change anyone's mind or change society in any way. However, the effect that relativity had on the way that we think and see the world was huge. We see ourselves much part of that thing of the abstract ideas that we create in physics and mathematics can have a role in changing people's minds, but we may not know what it is. Okay? And in that point I see the scientist as an artist. So we've had this discussion about the difference between science and arts and who's a scientist, who's an artist, who's an engineer. I've even heard this is now a question. We see ourselves not wanting to engage in that pigeonholing and siloing, which I think we all agree with, but very much so as the scientist as artist in our program. I want to be negative a bit because I notice around this room there's been a lot of reinforced optimism and then we're all marvellous and we're changing society, climate, we solve, everything's fine. There have been problems over the last 10 years and I think we have to own up and talk about them a bit, especially in this sort of audience. The ways of working between arts and sciences is very problematic. Essentially different modes of working, different personalities. And then things come out like the ownership of ideas can be very problematic. Finding the right artist and the right scientist to work together is a theme that's come up again and again, that you can't just take any scientist and any artist and expect it's all going to go lovely. But then for me, as I said, I'm very interested in the abstract ideas that science has produced over the years And finding the right medium for abstraction is a very interesting problem. It's happened in music, it's happened in multimedia things. I'm open to everything, but I think it's one of the problems that we embrace, and in the work that we've done, we've ended up working with almost every single medium in every sort of type of the arts. And I'm never satisfied with any one of them, but I think that's the nature of the thing, and that we have to do as much as we can. So I'll end in just some snapshots of stuff that range from sculpture, installations, some work I did at the Biennale, and a whole host of stuff, and some stuff with Cartier, and some films that were made. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Next is Manuelle.
I actually don't need the clicker. Do I? Yes. Thank you. So I'm going to just let this video run while I talk a little bit about the activities that have got me involved in art science in the last year and a half. These activities were conducted in the framework of a postdoctoral research that I conducted here in Paris as part of the Arts and Science Research Chair. I will not speak of the whole programming of the chair because my colleague Julie will have an intervention tomorrow about that. My own work was much based on developing activities that brought together artists, designers, and scientists in the context of practice to collaborate. And today I'm going to focus on one of the projects, the Behavioral Matter Workshops, that was organized here at the Pompidou on March 15, 16, and 17 of 2019. These workshops were not just an activity by themselves. They were planned and they were integrated in a body of other activities that we started from the beginning of the semester in September, and with bringing our students, our graduate students, to think about the relationship that they had around behavioral matter, which was one of the themes of research at ENSAD, l'École nationale supérieure des arts déco, which is the lab where I was inserted. And we came through, in collaboration also with Ircam and Vertigo, and with the exhibition La Fabrique du Vivant, we came to organize these workshops. And they consisted of having almost 80 people work together in the forum of the Pompidou, divided in 12 clusters. And each cluster was organized either by an artist or a scientist. These could be students, graduate students, or these could be professionals. And the premise, well, there was actually three premises to this exercise. First, the clusters had to bring together, of course, art science in a different interdisciplinary configuration. So the different groups were bringing different disciplines together. The second premise of the exercise was each group had to define material conditions, basic material conditions around which their group was going to work over 3 days. And the third part that was very important to this exercise was the direct contact with the public. So the forum is the lobby area, the entrance at the Pompidou. So in March, and at the time there was an exhibition by Vasarely, there was a very, very big attendance. And so we were able to gather around this space that we had formed a small crowd. So there was activities of mediation that were also developed around that space. So only to give you an idea of the few clusters that we curated and that then led their own work. There was, for example, behavioral objects, so connected objects, a group working with connected objects equipped with sensors that react to their environment. And this group sent out robots to explore the Place Georges Pompidou to interact with pigeons. There was a group started by an engineer on robotic tensegrity. So this was a work on tensegrity structures and bases, because his research is based on how the spinal cord functions to maintain balance and posture, and he investigates how robotics can be applied to structures that operate live micro-adjustments to maintain its structural integrity when subjected to external forces. This group in particular worked with a lot of props on the table, and these were very useful to communicate with the public and to explain with this rather complex concepts of integrity. We have another group that was initiated by a graduate student. There was the next rice, and she was investigating the different types of rice as the second cereal that is most consumed by humans. And she was printing this group, they were printing a rice paste that was then based on a survey that had circulated with the public on how do they prefer their rice. Of course, because of matters of hygiene and safety, we weren't able to then consume that paste. But it was also a different type of exercise. There was a group from Polytechnique, because the Chaire Arts et Sciences is held by both ENSAD Lab and École Polytechnique, on the behavior of fog, so exercise around the hydrodynamics. So there was 12 of them. I'm not going to go through all of them. And so as you can imagine, over 3 days, these groups were working, experimenting based on rapid prototyping, on demos, and material engagement. One of the problems that we were faced from very early on was how to integrate scholars from the humanities in this exercise. And so we had how to allow for moments of reflection in such a frantic sort of environment of making. And for that, we had the 13th table in the space was a radio, was a space where people, scholars and participants could come and sit down, and with headphones they could sit around the table and have some reflection on the work that was being conducted. And finally, in regards to this entire exercise, was of course the contact with the public. This isn't what we would consider citizen science, because the public is not immediately engaged in the production of the material, engaging with the practices or with the knowledge that was being conducted. But it was quite surprising to see how people engaged with the making of research and creation live. And it certainly allowed to demystify all these ideas that research and innovation and creation happen like that. When you have an idea, you set to do it. All these demos, all these objects that were lingering around the space that were sort of functioning or half functioning or not functioning really make for an open door for discussion. Objects that are not completed are much more approachable, and the public is not hesitant to hold them. So we're trying to bring these workshops now to other places, namely to Montreal, where I'm now based. And we're trying to make a second iteration of this exercise, which we hope will evolve based on this first experience.
David.
Thank you. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the people of the Turrbal and Jagera nations, excuse me, the traditional owners of the land on which I work and live, excuse me, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Please excuse me, I'm extremely sleep deprived, so I'm going to need some notes today just to follow along. I heard we could have 3 slides. I decided to do it in 2 and fill it out with the title slide. That means not very much, but anyway. I want to do something a little different to many of the contributors to this symposium so far today. I'm a practicing artist and collaborator and have been a physicist and journalist, but I want to take a step back from specific instances and examples and take a more theoretical stance to see whether that can help us understand and possibly improve or develop new forms of residencies and collaborations. Given this short time today, I'm going to ask more questions than provide answers, but I hope that raising these questions might be useful. We don't yet have a comprehensive model of the types of art and science collaborations that exist. A few people have drafted categorizations, but they include just a few factors that, consciously or not, represent particular priorities. So how can we more fully characterize the broad range of art-science collaboration that we observe? For example, residency often implies a physical location for collaboration, and that influences the kind of work done in that collaboration and on whose terms. Just by framing collaboration in that way, we can inadvertently impose particular values on what we consider to be important about this type of work. What other framings are useful for thinking about collaboration between artists and scientists, and what do we observe actually happening? In understanding collaboration, there are too many relevant factors to accommodate in an easily comprehensible model. However, the act of creating a taxonomy can help us think through what is significant. What we can observe is that if we design collaborations focusing on certain factors over others, we strongly influence the nature of the collaborative process. Our choices for implementing one factor, such as location or anticipated outcomes, influence how other factors play out. Our framing determines our understanding and our practice. For example, suppose we classify collaborations in terms of the location of the work: a scientific lab, an artistic institution, a third or neutral location, or an individual studio, or other possibilities. This would be a natural way to think about what we call residencies, but location might not be the factor that is most important to understanding what happens in those collaborations. What if the more important factor is who pays for the work, or who has explicit or implicit control over the direction, progress, and pace of the collaborative work? How does the mere fact of putting artists in a scientific lab influence the power structure and the kinds of outcomes we have? If we frame a collaboration by requiring an artistic outcome, what does that imply for the operational structure, duration of the collaboration, and responsibilities of the participants? When we examine the multidimensional possibilities of collaboration, the factors we focus on tell us something about our priorities and values. So we can look at one data set in a lot of different ways in this multidimensional problem. And this is just sort of a schematic illustration. So we have a large number of collaborations out there. If we look at it in terms of what matters in terms of location, it might break down into a few groups, which might correlate with funding in certain ways. But if we look at it instead in terms of the anticipated outcomes and see how that matches up with actual outcomes, we have a very different view. And the one we choose matters. It's how we think about these things. There are a lot of factors. This is just a rough draft list of things that seem to matter in practice or seem to matter theoretically. And for each of these factors down the bottom, there are many possible options, right? So this is a big space of possibilities. So another approach to interrogating this vast space of possibilities is a topological approach, a kind of clustering of data. Just as in a statistical factor analysis, we don't decide what dimensions matter most. The data tell us how things play out. But what does this clustering look like? One possibility is the emergence of a set of archetypes of collaboration. So if we think about new collaborations or residencies, do they seem to fit into one of these archetypes? If they do, what other baggage does that bring along? What lessons can we learn by considering which archetypes of collaboration we engage with? This, I'll just say again, is a draft schematic to give you some idea of it. You will recognize some of these modes of collaboration. Many of you are involved in a number of them. Some of them you will see as what you might call undesirable, but we see them. This is how a lot of people work in some of these programs. So when we consider new residency programs, should we think about the unexplored space of possibilities? Can we go beyond these observed archetypes? The most common artist-in-residence model that I see involves a single artist spending time in a scientific institution where they interact with scientists who donate their time on their terms, with the artist expected to make works of art for exhibition. Right? This leads to certain kinds of outcomes and not others. I'm very pleased that many of the people in this room don't operate just in that mode. We have a lot of other possibilities, but we see this a lot. Many institutions using that default model, though, of the artist-in-residence, are they using it as a matter of expediency, because it's convenient, because it's a known model? What implicit political statement does that carry about power, control, hierarchy, and values? Can we explore different factors more deeply? Might we consciously express our values through the construction of collaborations that bring particular factors into prominence? Or at least, can we use this kind of scheme to help us consciously understand what we care about when we bring artists and scientists together? Residencies and collaborations can be a rich and beautiful way of working, but how do we make the most of them? And what tools can we build to better understand excuse me, the practices of the present and the possibilities of the future. Thank you.
And Claudia, if you could pass the clicker, please.
Thank you. So I also heard this about the 3 slides, and I decided to fully pack them with everything. And you decide in the end what you want to have, or where you want to ask more questions. So I also start, maybe, I'm not sure if you all hear me. I also start with a little bit my background and where I'm coming from and why I'm sitting here as well. So I started actually, and this was really, really interesting, having Ariane's keynote right in the beginning, also with artistic interventions in organizations. And I was researching from the organizational perspective, why do we want to have such interventions? What are possibilities? And I soon focused on art science or artists in R&D departments, because I found this extremely interesting and I saw that there is a lot going on there. And after that, I, again, drawing from Ariane's wonderful keynote, I decided I don't only want to do inquiry, I want to do inquiry and action somehow at the same time. So I started to work with residency opportunities, so working with different kinds of organizations and programs to create collaborations between artists and scientists. And I soon found out that although I always bothered with we have to be conscious that we do not instrumentalize the artists, and we do not we have also to ask the question, what does the artist get out of it? That it's very difficult to bridge between organizations and the artists, but also with scientists who have a long, long trajectory to come to where they are in their career, to argue why it's valuable for them to work with artists, why to give their time, why to spend the time with the artists to co-create or to collaborate, or also why to spend all the funds on that. So I used the tools that I gathered from this organizational perspective, also from it's drawing from social science, anthropology, social psychology, and so on, to understand what these residencies or collaborations can do. And I started to approach this from 3 different questions, actually. The first one is, what does actually the encounter of art and the encounter of the artist do with us? And how is this valuable? And then going further, what does it actually, what kind of change is created, and how is this collaboration affecting our own work processes? The artist and the scientist actually both. And then again, going the next step to argue where's the organizational part, the organizational point of view, because I think we always have to go all these steps, start from the individual experience, what we experience, what we do, then how to communicate this in the group we are working in, and then we can actually go and see how it affects society or how we can connect it to cultural change. So I don't think that I have time to go into details into these examples, but actually they are actually, on the one hand, I can experience the art. And the last one, I think, is a really interesting organizational point of view. And we heard this today quite often. So what is actually coming out of the residency? And often it's not just coming out an artwork, because the last project, it was creating a tattooing machine of this industrial robot arm at Autodesk at Pier 9 residency. And in the end, it was all the value it was created in the organization was way beyond this tattooing machine. It was actually creating the opportunity for the safety department to have create a kind of a new knowledge, a new access to how they actually want to approach these new possibilities they create with their own technologies. And it really often needs this outside perspective to understand this. And seeing all these different projects happening, and using the tools I gathered before in my academic work, I wanted to analyze art science collaborations, and I think I talked to, in this book I have more than 20 cases, trying to understand what does it do on an individual level and how these collaborations affect us, and really also going beyond this, these buzzwords like communication and creativity, and to understand what does it actually mean to have heightened creativity to art science collaboration, because it's not just one, like spilling over like a virus. And making you automatically creative. There are so many different aspects that can help you in meeting somebody from a different discipline that then can influence your creativity. And also talking about communication. Communication is also something that's very present, and it's often understood as artists visualize the science, or it's just more outreach, but it goes way beyond that, because it also is interested in how do we talk to each other, how do we learn to talk to each other. The same vocabulary might mean different things in different worlds, in the arts and the scientists, or in the organization itself. So going one step further, so it's not only the interest, what does it do with us, so what can we do with this information to bridge art and science better, and how do we learn from these insights? And as we just heard, it's not only the residencies, so there are different kind of formats. How do we want to create these collaborations, and is a residency or a fellowship always the right thing we want to do, or are there other opportunities? And I think from my experience, it's very much depending on the goal and the organization, what we want to do. Another point, I think it's up, but yeah, somewhere here it should be. I'm just speaking about this. So it's process focus, outcome focus. As we heard, there are lots of residencies that want an outcome, an artistic outcome at the end. But you don't want to have a scientific outcome at the end of a 3-month residency. So why do you want to have an immediate artistic outcome? So when do we want to have the outcome, and where do we place it? And yeah, asking all these questions in order to create residencies. And yeah, one last or two last things is, again, things we should not forget. So everybody has to be open, curious, and not to be afraid of feeling stupid in these collaborations. There needs to be space and time. We cannot just do it on the side of our fully packed workday, a loaded workday. And there needs to be some curation, intermediary. Ariane framed it as an intermediary curation, facilitation. Every project it's different. So I think this is really something that we need to keep in mind for any interaction, because this person can be the one who translates but also balances the interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights. Now, while you prepare your questions, I have a small comment, and then I have a very, very simple question. Now, my university has entrusted me to pull together anyone working in technology, art, and digital humanities in a transdisciplinary center. So you've now given me loads of input. 2 books I have to read. This is very good. I also... It makes me thinking a little bit, because we're always talking about bridging art and science. We're talking about bridging art and technology. We're doing art and. Why don't we ever talk about bridging science and art? Mm-hmm. That might be a little different. So maybe the next instrument should be a scientist in residence in an art collective. This would probably open up the field a little bit, because I think many of you have said it's about the trust, it's about the ways of working together. So I think the question coming out of this is, if we want to bridge something, it seems to me in a simplified world that the artist has their practice, the scientist the paper, and the engineer the prototypes. Which other instruments can you use to bridge these fields other than a residency or including a residency? That's a question to you all.
But can you repeat the examples you gave? Think beyond prototype.
The artists and their practice,
Okay.
the scientist and the paper,
Okay.
and the engineer and the prototype or the prototypes or the model.
Just one thing. I think also the scientist has their practice, or the engineer, everybody. I think it's very important to understand that these practices meet, and that from meeting the practices you can learn from each other. So I think it's not, you should not, it's more the scientist and the paper and the artist and yet the artwork,
Yeah.
if you can say it like that. But the practice is there for everybody, and I think that's really this kind of embodied knowledge and tacit knowledge in the methodologies we all have, we are not aware of, we are often not aware of, and that when we meet somebody from a different discipline working on the same idea or topic from a completely different perspective, but also bringing in different methods, we get aware of how we look at things ourselves.
Can I just add a quick one? So one of the issues I brought up was ownership. So it's interesting that you put the artwork as being owned by the artist and the prototype being owned by the engineer. And in any collaboration, and this is something I actually insist on, all the collaborators get equal merit and equal association of ownership, because then that creates a structure which is very different to somebody working for someone else, somebody being exploited or whatever it may be. It creates a thing of real shared experience in that practice. And I think that was also what you were talking about, that if there is value there, then that value goes all the way through to the final products, whatever they may be, and not separate ownership into these named things that we've had.
So, two ways to respond to that question. Well, probably more, but two that I'll choose. First, in addition to the artifact, whether it's artwork, a prototype, or a paper, or for that matter, a theorem or a theory, and the practice, which is more ongoing, there are the other outcomes or outputs that might be generated at residency, however we define it, could include creating enterprise, an institute, business, an organization, creating policy or policy advice framework, priorities, creating experience, ongoing or a singular program. So that's one sort of list of some other things that could happen, that could be generated and be real. But there's also, I want to go back to something that was said earlier by me, which is that some things that are unmeasurable, the unmeasurable outputs and outcomes and results might be the things that have immeasurable impact, that might be the things that have the greatest consequence. So it might be certainly sparking new ideas, but really new ways of looking at the world or being in the world. You know, how do I measure the experience of being inspired, and how that carries over into the interaction I now have with Manuelle, or with David, or with someone I haven't yet met in the room, or someone I'm going to connect with next week. You know, I think that we need to recognize the value, not only of the intrinsic experience, but that magic that happens afterwards as part of the value that these residencies, however we define and approach them, offer.
Yeah, to your question, I think that it actually gets at one of the fundamental issues about transdisciplinarity, not just between art and science. What does transdisciplinary knowledge look like? Because it seems pretty clear that in the art science space, it's more than just an artwork plus a science paper. And you've mentioned a couple of possibilities in that direction, but I think it's really hard to grapple with, and it's why transdisciplinarity, I think, is a concept spoken about theoretically more than in practice. I think that the concept of art science, as espoused through Leonardo and the series of editorials, right, is a really interesting one. But what is it? What is it that's separate from artworks and works of science and these kinds of things? And I think it's hard to put your finger on it. I think it's hard to come up with concrete examples because probably part of it is somewhat ephemeral, or it's indescribable or unmeasurable, or these sorts of things. So, maybe you have a different perspective on that, but to me, that hasn't really come through clearly, and I think that's common to transdisciplinarity as a concept.
Can I just add something? I think this is what I was interested in with one of the edited book I was on, is this idea of, you kind of touched on it, but it's another piece I think I would want to add, which is methods, frameworks, process. We're all often, especially in academic and probably in science and technology, focused on output, and we've talked about that being one thing, but process, I think, is, in my experience anyway, almost more important. And if there's an experience, like you mentioned, that comes out of that process that hatches maybe new processes or new ways of thinking, I think that, to me, is more important than the output, because it then leads to more outputs, whatever they might be. So process, methods, frame, and I feel like I'm always arguing this with certain interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary groups, though, that arts can have just as many methods and methodologies as science and technology, and the only difference is that the rules are shifting all the time, and they're sometimes made up by the artists, bringing different things together and in different permutations, and then sharing that new method or new methodology.
I think I would add, in response to your question, and maybe to extend what David just said, that in our experience, as you mentioned, these conversations become very intangible. We speak of collaborations and the implications and the difficulties of them. And you asked what instruments are there to bring together artists and scientists. And in our experience, all instruments, in fact, the instruments and the materials and the demos and the material conditions of engagement of the experience, I think, are much more conducive to integration of knowledge than discussion and debate. And so the experiences that we had in the workshops, compared to symposiums, which we also organize, with journée d'études that we also organize, is that in this context, around practice and around objects, people sort of engage immediately in conversation and lose much the preconceived roles of the different actors around the table, just go out the window much faster than when you're debating and conversing. I think people start experimenting and people start touching and saying, "Oh, you do this like this, I do this like that," and then it's much more integrative than confrontational around material conditions.
Thank you very much. I think I completely agree. I think it's a process. I would call the process research, and I would say you have artistic research, scientific research, and technical research, which have similar methodologies, and that's what we're trying to bridge. That's what we're trying to get together. That's at least what I'm trying to get to work together. I think a lot of the publications, maybe in Leonardo, also on this actual process, on the research methodologies and how they work together. Anyone from the audience have a comment to this or a question? Are there some microphones, or it's mine?
So yes, we've spoken a lot about what interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity can bring to one's reflection in any framework, actually. But then we did not address what is the specificity of art as a specific contributor to this interdisciplinary exchange. So you started to answer by saying that, Emmanuelle started to answer by saying that when it's mediated by some artifacts, it facilitates, but it can be engineered at this stage. So what is really the specific aspect that artists bring. And this was actually a question in Start Residencies, because we decided to pay artists to make an artwork, even if at the end there is no artwork. But there was the initial goal of that artistic production process, which drove all the process. So what do you think of this specificity of artists?
Well, since you mentioned me, the place, the role, or how, I don't know how to call it, what art brings to these encounters is a space of convergence, is an opportunity of convergence. In our experience, art is that which perhaps other disciplines than the artistic disciplines are less, is less porous to forms of knowledge that are not validated or they're not established. And so people converge to these places to explore the possibilities, when we create spaces and what do I call them, are experiments in research design. So people, other scholars, other researchers, other disciplines converge to these spaces because they are looking for this collaboration. They are looking for this space of opportunity where they can verge into other directions, or they can be veered off into other directions. And I think what art has, at least my experience is more, of course, in academia. Art as a space of research, as a field of research, is the place that allows for that.
Hello, thank you very much for all your talks. They were very, very interesting. My name is Alejandro. I work for an art center in Barcelona. I have a double question about the artists, art, science, and technology residencies. One is the necessity to have a neutral space that all these people meet. Do you think works better than sending the artists to the labs or sending the, like you say now, the scientists to the art studios? And the second question is the conceptual framework. When you define people like artists or scientists, you are defining them like different animal species. And I think we need to start talking about people who works in art, people who works in science, and people who develops skills in art thinking, and people who develops skills in more mathematical and abstract construction. And in this way, I think we could bring much better all these people together. What do you think about? Thank you.
The great questions. So let me briefly touch on both to give time for my colleagues. In terms of the value of neutral space, that's what you're asking, right? As opposed to bringing an artist into a scientific environment or a technical environment, or the other way around, bringing a scientist or a technologist into a culture or arts environment. Of course, I mean, there's some implicit bias in your question. And so, of course, neutral would be best because everyone's equal. However, and clearly in the two examples I gave, there's a bit of that. So the Gerasi example of scientific delirium madness is a neutral space. It's neutral, natural. It's out in nature, and it's half and half, which gets to the next question. Scientists and artists, more or less. And in that neutral space, there's freedom for all kinds of creative collaborations to emerge. At the same time, I would say there's value in experiencing and becoming resident in an environment that's different from what you're used to. And maybe that's not neutral. Going back to the comfort with discomfort that Tilly mentioned earlier, I think is really important. There's value in putting yourself in a completely new place, and even in that power dynamic, so that we can question it and we can start to break it down and make it more fluid. And I think it gets to the question of how do we share power, and how might we reclaim power as something that we give. what is the power of invitation and giving power, not just as something that we acquire and get that's finite, rather as something that we offer and give out as a way that we experience power, which comes to the definitions and categories. If we use those definitions to close ourselves off, we disempower ourselves and we limit our imagination and our creative output. I'm starting to experiment, and I'd welcome others' experimentations with language of hybrid creative practitioners and some would say scholars, thought leaders, inquirers, researchers, but the thinking part. So hybrid creatives, how might we become fluid in that, which is not to say the specificity of art or science or other disciplines goes away. It's to say that we are moving towards disciplinarity, and that's how we're doing it. By becoming more hybrid. And we're building institutions and experiences that support that. So certainly at institutions I'm involved with, we have transdisciplinary structures, incentives, rewards, acknowledgement, and opportunities.
A neutral space is clearly best for some definition of best, but for different definitions of best, neutral space is worst, right? So the thing is, I think, in terms of the framework that I was talking about before, you can't separate that factor from others necessarily. One factor influences others. So it depends on the values you bring to this. It depends not just the goal, right? It's that is even too prescriptive in some way. If you define things via a goal, that tells you what has to happen in some of the other factors. So, how we navigate this is most certainly tricky. And I think that, for me, what's most in my mind as I think about this is how do I try to be conscious of these choices and these factors so that I can situate all these different moving parts relative to each other.
I think a lot has been said, but especially as long as we are not yet used to these interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approaches, and we don't have that much hybrid experience, it's extremely important to think that there is somebody helping, so the intermediary, the curator, the facilitator, somebody translating between the disciplines, but also within the organization. So often it does not, and I think this is what also your question is referring to, it's not only the space that the two people who meet experience, it's also what's the interest of the organization around it and how to communicate it there and why to give the space and why not to instrumentalize what we're doing here for the organization. And I think there curators and also other facilitators and intermediaries can have play an important role on the one hand because they are not so much they can balance the interests, so they are not the artists, they are not the scientists, they are not the organization, so they can talk to each other and they can show what is important to whom. So I think this is something that's very important to keep in mind as long as we are not so elaborate on these issues, how to frame them.
I think we take a question down here.
Yeah, I like the answer of the definition between the artist and the scientist beforehand, because you were pointing to actually that the definition of it is the process that leads to a certain outcome. My colleagues, the scientists, sitting together with my colleagues, the artists, my colleagues, the scientists, write a paper in the end. And my colleagues, the artists, they make a performance or a piece or music or whatever with it, which leads also to a different kind of an attitude towards ownership. Ownership for... my university gave one of the artists in residence a contract, because as a non-employee they have to give a contract to be able to work there for a year. And suddenly he was very mad because it was in there that it was kind of a ownership of university, because they develop high-tech stuff there. So he couldn't disclose it, and that the ownership of the outcome of the residency would always belong to university. And he said, well, but that's my job, to bring out an artwork, But also, it was also hindered by the fact that there was on certain IoT objects, there was a patent running. And if you bring it out in the public sphere, you cannot hand it in for patents anymore. So it's a very complex issue, but the ownership of the artist will always, legally, he's always, or she is always protected by copyright as an artist. Yeah? So that's a good statement for it. What I think is that the discussion goes the whole time too much from the traditional organizational point of view of art and science, and then we need, of course, a lot of artificial bridges between them. Because I know a lot of very intelligent artists and very, very good technological artists, and usually they don't go to the institutions as professional artists, but they develop it themselves. They're smart enough to read through scientific papers and knowledge to get to a certain point where they can make their own technology almost, and nowadays it gets easier and easier and cheaper, than to have to go for a residency with all the hassle, with all the things involved, and then be there and be obliged to go into kind of a system that tells them that they are different from the scientists. So my basic question is this neutral space not already, thanks to the good work of Leonardo and everyone else for 50 years, already a lot happening without the whole institutional, conventional background, which is very, very slow to change?
While you think about your responses, I'd just like to say, I'd like to say that in Denmark they just awarded a large research project to the Copenhagen School of Business, which is a project on art, technology, and law. So I think you'd be interested in that because they're attracting exactly this problem. Do you have any comments?
Maybe one quick one. I like the comment at the end that individuals have a place and it's not just institutions, because the residency thing does have the disadvantage that it's very institutionalized. As a scientist, I'm fortunate enough in some sense to be an individual in the sense that I work in pure theory, so I don't require CERN and all the other things that go on, which gives you a certain sense of freedom. And I think the artists that also feel that they can do that within their own studio environment also have that. And I think the more that we have individuals merge with these things from both sides, the better.
Joe, do you want to go?
I think this question of authorship is very important, and it comes up every residency or every program that starts how to talk about the authorship, how to talk about IP, who is collaborating, who owns what, and how can we own things together. And of course, I understand your comment that artists many artists are smart enough to do their own research in technology. They can read through scientific papers. But I'm not sure if this is actually what we want to reach with these collaborations, and if these collaborations and bringing artists in these environments that also has somehow the goal to slowly change a common understanding in these organizations and how we approach ownership, how we approach working together. And of course things take a long time, especially when you have organizations and other policymakers involved. Of course it takes some time, but I'm not sure that it's only about creating access for individual persons who then can create an artwork that will be exhibited, but then again misses the connection to other fields.
I don't necessarily agree, because most of the programs we know are actually, it's much of more the pressure of industry on certain organizations within the academic and university world that is pushing into change, not the artist. And the opposite is the same as well, is that there are many initiatives on citizen science and so on that you see happening in the whole time with artists that are mainly used as a kind of, okay, now make that bridge to an audience, not to the organization. I mean, there are good things that happen around the world with all this, but you cannot look away from what the majority is molding out of it. And that sometimes is a bit sad, you know. So the change in, and I maintain that the change in the organization is much more of an economical, financial, and industrial pressure than it is from the art field.
Okay,
Can I
I
say
think
something?
one small comment and then we'll
Okay.
change to another question.
I mean, I'm just going to comment from the point of view of the WEARSustain project because they were design projects more than they were artworks. And we came into a lot of issues around IP. But I think as, let's say, intermediaries, which there are many in the room, I think that's also part of the goal is to create the collaboration involves discussing those kinds of things on the outset and agreeing what is going to happen at the end before you get to these kinds of situations in the first place. So creating a mutual goal of what's going to happen with the work in the end. And that's how things change also institutionally, or agreeing that things are going to be open source from both sides. And yes, that's not easy. We came across a lot of problems with that, but it starts with the goals of coming together in the first place and not waiting till there's a problem later on.
One, another question.
So I think there's also a space besides the larger research institutions and the large corporations that, to me as an artist, is quite appealing, and that's the growing movement of these small scientific spaces, biospaces, like level 1 labs. Sometimes they're level 2 labs. They're all over the world. There's one in my community that I belong to, and they're comprised of primarily scientists, educators, artists who don't want to practice in their own institutions, have no interest in any bureaucracy. They do most everything on a volunteer basis, but they actually have these membership-based labs, and sometimes they're hacker spaces where they have they've all come together, pooled their money, and bought equipment together. And then they have resident programs for artists and scientists, and it's incredibly collaborative because they're working on projects that they have they don't have to go up any sort of chain of command to ask to do. And I think those are a really fruitful area to be looked at because they're incredibly agile. They don't have to ask for permission. They have the same research scientists that have brilliant awards and published papers that the big labs at the universities and national research centers have. They just do it on their own time, and it's their volunteer passion and space. They have a lot of artists involved in what they're doing. So I don't know if that's something that you've all have explored, but I see this as very rapidly growing and very attractive for artists to be working in, and scientists as well because of paperwork.
I am involved in having started such an organisation in my town by working with some scientists who very precisely that wanted to do this work outside the structure of the university, partly to make it more open to people who couldn't get access to the university and to not deal with the university. And you point out that these people, some of these scientists still have the skills and everything that come from being in that institution but are applying it outside. I would actually also say that when we talk about, say, scientists working in an institution, you really do need to separate the scientist from the institution. And although in many cases the scientist works according to the institution as like a cog in the institutional machine, that's also not always the case. There are plenty of scientists that I've worked with in institutions who are basically, maybe they shouldn't be, but they're using the facilities and the time and all this sort of stuff to do sort of side projects, right? So they're not doing it according to those rules, but they're still using it in some way, right? So.
Take one more question from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. I was listening, just thinking to what extent art and artists actually benefit your institutions, your initiatives, your disciplines, transdisciplinarity, and so forth. It's a lot less clear to me the extent to which all this discourse, all these ideas actually contribute to art or to the discourse in art or to the art practices. It's totally unclear to me. And sorry, this is just a remark.
But
Do you mean it's unclear the benefit to the artist or to the host?
I'm talking about art.
Okay.
I'm talking
The art
about
world.
art practice with a capital A and a capital P. I'm talking about the discourse in art. I'm talking about
Okay.
where art is today. And even though socially engaged practices are growing, and obviously artists are very interested in the interface with science and other disciplines, it's a lot less clear how these methodologies, frameworks, spaces, neutralities, and so forth, or collaborations, generosity, etc., actually benefit the art with a capital A and the art practice.
So I can start on that one. I've learned and experienced that artists benefit directly in many ways from this experience, and we might certainly find ways to improve that benefit and or cluster of benefits, and we'll want to be learning from each other how to do that. But artists already from these residencies speak of the invaluable benefit of having that time and space. Having time and space. That's the first thing.
I'm not talking about art, about the subject of art, rather than the individual experience
Okay.
of art.
So from the subject of art then, the practice of art as a field, as a whole, I think that just as we claim rightly that other fields benefit from having artists' presence, we could learn too. And art as a field can benefit from having immersive engagement with science, with technology, with technical expertise that may not come from working in isolation or even in collaboration with other artists. I've certainly seen and experienced that with artists who are learning augmented reality skills, who are learning about neurobiology, about astrogeology, and how these very technical skills and fields and expertise are showing them new ways of experimenting with art. So those are some specific examples of individuals I'm thinking of. I think that enriches the field and practice of art enormously. And so I think that we're not static as we in the arts, any more that we would be static in any other enterprise or field. And so I think that the field benefits from having transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, immersive experience.
But I guess I'd agree that this is happening anyway. I mean, sorry. This is just
Well, I don't think maybe that's going to happen anyway, but residencies can be accelerators and enablers to deepen that experience.
Well, I mean, we can think of specific examples in history that have changed the practice of art from these kinds of collaborations. We think of something like experiments in art and technology in New York in the 50s or 60s. I'm suddenly losing track of my timeline. This introduced an entirely new kind of art practice that still has many repercussions today. And I think there are other examples in bioart and other kinds of areas. Yeah.
Okay, we're getting to the end of this panel. I would like to take the privilege of the last question, because I always, there's something I would like to just hear if you have experienced. Through my years of working on bridging art, science and technology, I have always found it's much easier to engage the people working with art, and they will stay longer in the collaboration, and it's incredibly hard to attract the people working in science and technology. They will be interested for a while, but they will drop out much, much faster than those working with art. Have you had similar experiences, and how do we solve this?
I'll just quickly say I think that's an ongoing project.
I've most definitely had that experience. I had a really interesting project and just got ghosted by the scientist. just totally disappeared, stopped replying to anything, and it had been going so well. To this day, I don't know what happened, and I'm really disappointed.
They're just not that into it.
Yeah, absolutely, just not that into me. But you're quite right. So it does happen, and I think that part of the reason for that is that in most of these collaborations, the scientists are so often doing it as a side project. whereas this is the artist's life. This is what they do. And there is this imbalance in motivation, and that leads to all kinds of other factors that play into it.
Funding.
It's power. It's power.
Yeah.
So there's a different infrastructural incentive for the fields of art and the fields of science. So as much as we segment that out and try and pull it together, there's an imbalance of power, and that's one of the dynamics that I think results in expression of that. But to the extent that we begin to create new infrastructure, new power sharing dynamics, and more integrated hybrid practice, that breaks down some of that dynamic, and then maybe you get more dates.
So I think what we found at the university is that there was a lot of words said by, say, the principal of the university. Yeah, this is a great thing, but at no point did that feed into a genuine structure of reward. I consult for one of the research councils in the UK, and we look at how we create structures of reward in outreach. Because although everyone can have a sort of moral stance and say these things are good, or you're paid by the government, I heard someone say that's the reason for doing something. But in the end, if the complexity of the issue is how you can create a motivation for the scientists to do it beyond just their own personal interest. Because in the end, the time cost is something that's very high, and that's what leads to this behavior.
Thank you so much. And for me, I would say that Tilly actually expressed it pretty nicely. If you want to have someone from technology or science work on your project, find someone, a professor that's close to emeritus. So I'd like to say I'm available if you want to do any collaboration. And also if you show up to the panel tomorrow at 11:30, Alex, Mary Leslie down there, and myself are actually going to give a keynote introducing the panel of how we have done this, how we have created incentives, how our rector at our university is actually funding significantly for this to work. So thank you very much to the panel, and thank you.